Here's something strange about history's most famous traitors. Almost none of them needed the money. Almost none of them were outsiders looking for a way in. Nearly every name that ends up as a byword for betrayal belonged to someone already trusted, already protected, already standing closer to power than the people they eventually destroyed. That's the part the word traitor quietly erases. We use it like a diagnosis, as if some people are simply built for treachery, and the rest of us are safe from it by nature. But look closely at the actual sequence of events in most of these cases, and a different, more uncomfortable pattern starts to show up. A slight, a debt, a belief that everyone else had already broken the rules first, a conviction, sincerely held, that betraying one loyalty was the only way to honor a bigger one. None of that is an excuse. It might be something worse than an excuse, evidence that the line between the trusted and the traitor is thinner and closer to home than the dictionary definition wants you to think. So instead of asking who these people were, we're going to ask something the history books tend to skip. What did it actually feel like, from the inside, in the hour before they crossed it? Because in case after case, the people who committed the worst betrayals in recorded history did not think of themselves as villains. They thought they were doing the right thing. That's the part that should worry you. Not because it makes them innocent, but because it means the usual comfort we take from stories like these. The idea that we would obviously see it coming, obviously refuse, obviously be different, might not hold up nearly as well as we'd like to believe once you actually sit with how these decisions got made. History likes to hand these people over to us already sealed inside their reputations, finished products, cautionary tales with the ambiguity sanded off. What gets lost in that packaging is the years, sometimes decades, of ordinary decisions that preceded the famous one, the part where a person who will eventually do something unforgivable is, for now, still just making choices that seem reasonable to them in the moment. 5 people, 5 different centuries, 5 completely different reasons for doing what they did. A statesman who genuinely believed he was saving his nation from a threat nobody else could see, and built a movement around that fear, only to watch a foreign army hand him the power his own countrymen had refused. A senator carrying an inherited duty older than he was, raised from childhood on the idea that no Roman should ever again bow to one man. A war hero who kept a running tally of every debt his country owed him, until the tally outweighed everything else he'd built. A local man who looked at the largest army on earth and recognized an opportunity rather than an invasion. And a disciple whose motive is still argued about 2,000 years later, in a story where even the people who wrote it down couldn't agree on why he did what he did. None of these cases are simple, and that's the reason they've lasted. A genuinely simple story gets forgotten fast, because there's nothing left to argue about once the facts settle. These 5 have survived because the facts never fully do. Put each man on the stand and he'd answer the same accusation 5 different ways. One insisting he saved his country, one insisting he restored it, one insisting a debt was finally being collected, one who likely wouldn't have understood the question as moral at all, and one who left behind so little of his own reasoning that scholars are still arguing, 2,000 years later, over which explanation even applies. We'll start with the one who might have believed his own story the hardest. In February of 1942, a man named Vidkun Quisling was installed as minister-president of a puppet government in Nazi-occupied Norway, and by the time the war ended 3 years later, his own countrymen despised him so completely that his surname stopped being a name at all, a fate that has befallen almost no one else in the entire history of the language. Open a dictionary today, in English or Norwegian, and you'll find Quisling, listed as a common noun, meaning a traitor who collaborates with an occupying enemy. The word crossed into French, German, and several other European languages within the same decade, which is a remarkably fast journey for a name to make from newspaper headline to shared vocabulary. It is, by some distance, the most successful piece of unintentional branding in modern history, and Quisling earned every letter of it. What makes his case worth investigating isn't the outcome. Everyone already knows the outcome. It's the 2 decades leading up to it, because Vidkun Quisling did not start out as anyone's idea of a fascist. He graduated from the Norwegian Military Academy with the best exam results the school had recorded in decades. In the early 1920s, he worked alongside the polar explorer and Nobel Peace Prize winner Fridtjof Nansen, coordinating famine relief in Soviet Russia and Ukraine, spending extended stretches at close range to a catastrophe that killed millions, not reading about it from a briefing document. Britain later awarded him a CBE for looking after their diplomatic interests in Moscow, after the two countries broke off relations. Colleagues from the period described someone precise, hardworking, and largely humorless, the sort of person you'd trust to manage a crisis rather than cause one. Whatever else you make of Quisling, the fear he carried out of that famine zone wasn't manufactured for political convenience. He'd watched a functioning society collapse from the inside, and he came home with a conviction that would eventually consume everything else about him. That conviction curdled slowly, across a decade, as Norway slid into the economic chaos of the Great Depression. Elsewhere in Europe, the same decade was producing the same kind of man by the dozen. Disillusioned veterans and failed politicians, convinced that liberal democracy itself had run out of answers, and Quisling watched those movements take power abroad, with an attention that reads, in hindsight, less like curiosity and more like rehearsal. Before he founded a movement of his own, he tried working the fear through the existing system, and it's worth noting how badly that attempt went, because it tells you something about the man underneath the ideology. In 1931, he was appointed Norway's Minister of Defense, a genuinely significant post, and used it to pick fights with striking laborers, order troops against workers he considered secretly Bolshevik, and accuse a substantial portion of parliament of treason. He was out of government within 2 years. Only after that failure did he look abroad for a model that might actually work. And in 1933 he found one, founding a political party modeled directly on the one taking shape in Germany. Uniforms, a paramilitary wing, a uncross standing in for the swastika. He gave himself the title of leader, apparently believing he was building the thing that would save Norway from the fate he'd watched consume Ukraine. The Norwegian public was not persuaded. His party pulled about 2% of the vote in 1933, and did worse 3 years later. A reasonable person facing those numbers draws the obvious conclusion. Quisling drew a different one. The party he built, National Samling, never held real electoral power on its own at any point in its existence. Every position of influence it eventually gained came from German occupation, not from Norwegian voters, which is worth remembering given how thoroughly Quisling would later insist he spoke for the nation. The order of what happened next matters, because it's the detail that complicates the tidy story of a man simply swept up by ideology. In December of 1939, with war already underway elsewhere in Europe, Quisling traveled to Germany and talked his way into Hitler's inner circle. Germany already had strategic reasons to want Norway's coastline. What Quisling offered was himself, intelligence on Norwegian defenses, and a personal assurance that the Norwegian people would welcome an occupation, provided he was the one running it afterward. He wasn't handed a role in someone else's invasion. He pitched himself for it, to a foreign power, against his own country, on the strength of a popularity his own election results should have told him didn't exist. Germany invaded on the 9th of April 1940, without telling him it was coming. That evening, Quisling walked into Norway's national radio station in Oslo, sat down at the microphone, and announced that the government had fled and that he was now prime minister. No one had appointed him, he simply declared it, live, to a country that made its answer clear within hours. King Haakon refused to recognize him, and the public response was disgust so intense that resistance to the occupation actually hardened because of it. Within 6 days, even the Germans concluded their hand-picked collaborator was a liability, and quietly took the government away from him, handing real power to a Reich commissioner sent from Berlin, who banned every party except, conveniently, Quisling's own, and ran the country with a cold administrative competence Quisling himself had never once managed. For nearly 2 years, Quisling watched someone else run the country he'd tried to hand over. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. In 1942, for reasons that had more to do with German administrative convenience than any renewed faith in his abilities, Quisling was reinstalled as minister-president. And this is the point where the story stops being one of delusion and miscalculation and becomes something else entirely. Under his government, members of the Norwegian resistance were tortured and executed. Over 1,000 teachers were arrested and sent to labor camps for refusing to join a fascist teachers' union. In the autumn of 1942, Quisling's own police force helped round up Norway's Jewish population, loading hundreds of men, women, and children onto ships bound for Auschwitz. Of the roughly 770 Jews deported from Norway, only a small fraction survived. Norway's Jewish community had been small to begin with, a few thousand people in a country of barely 3 million, which makes the completeness of the operation and the direct involvement of Quisling's own administration in carrying it out rather than merely tolerating German orders, a fact Norwegian historians have never treated as a footnote. By every account from his trial and his final statements, Quisling appears to have sincerely believed, through all of it, that he was Norway's protector. He surrendered to police in 1945, seemingly expecting to be received as a statesman who'd made difficult choices for his country's benefit. He was tried for treason, murder, and theft, and Norway, a country that had abolished the death penalty for civilian crimes 40 years earlier, brought it back specifically for men like him. The trial itself ran for weeks and drew enormous public attention, less because anyone doubted the verdict than because the country wanted a full accounting on the record of the deportations, the executions, the years of collaboration, rather than a quiet execution with no formal reckoning attached. He was executed by firing squad that October, at the same fortress the occupation had used to execute members of the resistance. In his final statement, he cast himself as a misunderstood patriot and predicted history would eventually vindicate him. It did the opposite. Within weeks of the 1940 invasion, British newspapers were already using his surname as shorthand for a collaborator, and Winston Churchill picked the word up in a wartime broadcast, calling it one that would carry the scorn of mankind down the centuries. His name didn't just become an insult. It became a category while he was still alive to read about it. What his case actually demonstrates is more unsettling than simple villainy, because self-belief and catastrophic harm turned out to be entirely compatible in the same person, at the same time. He wasn't lying to the Norwegian public when he claimed to be acting in their interest. The evidence suggests he wasn't lying to himself either, and appears to have held that belief right up to the firing squad. If sincerity doesn't rule out atrocity, sincerity was never much of a defense to begin with, no matter who's offering it. That question gets sharper with a man from 4 centuries earlier, because unlike Quisling, this next traitor didn't build an ideology from scratch. He inherited one, and it belonged to his own family, which raises a different kind of question than the one Quisling's case leaves behind. Not what happens when someone constructs a self-serving belief system out of genuine fear, but what happens when the belief system was already there, handed down, waiting for him before he'd made a single choice of his own. To understand why Marcus Junius Brutus ended up in a room with 60 conspirators, you have to go back to a civil war that had nothing to do with him at first. In 49 BCE, Julius Caesar, fresh off nearly a decade conquering Gaul and commanding an army that adored him, was ordered by the Senate to disband his forces and return to Rome to face prosecution. He crossed the Rubicon River instead, an act that automatically made him a public enemy under Roman law, and the civil war that followed pitted him against Pompey, once his ally and former son-in-law, now the Senate's champion. Caesar crushed Pompey's forces at Pharsalus in 48 BCE, and chased him to Egypt, where Pompey was murdered by locals before Caesar even reached shore. Brutus had fought for Pompey at that battle and, by the usual rules of ancient civil wars, should have had his story end there. Instead, Caesar gave explicit orders that he be spared, welcomed him back personally, and fast-tracked his career toward one of the Republic's top magistracies. That mercy is the foundation. Everything else in this story sits on top of. Brutus also claimed direct descent from the man who had overthrown Rome's last king nearly 500 years earlier, and Rome never let him forget it. Graffiti calling on him to live up to that ancestry started appearing on public statues in the months before March of 44 BCE. An unusual kind of pressure to build a conspiracy on. Not personal grievance, not greed, but inherited reputation, amplified by a city that seemed to be daring him to act. There's even a persistent claim in Roman sources that his mother had been the great love of Caesar's life for decades, pushed by some ancient gossip into the suggestion that Brutus might have been Caesar's own son. The chronology doesn't really support that particular rumor, but the fact that Romans were willing to entertain it tells you plainly how close these two men were understood to be. So why would a man kill someone who had shown him nothing but mercy and advancement? The answer historians keep landing on isn't personal at all. Rome's entire constitutional identity was built around the fear of exactly one thing: a king. The Republic had spent 4.5 centuries designing checks specifically to prevent any single man from accumulating unchecked, permanent power, magistracies split between rival officials, terms of office capped at a single year. Every serious concentration of authority hedged against by design, and Caesar had spent the previous 2 years dismantling those checks one at a time, from dictator for 10 years in 46 BCE, already alarming for a role designed as a 6-month emergency measure, to dictator for life by February of 44 BCE. To a man raised on the mythology of his own ancestor overthrowing a king, this wasn't abstract politics. It was the exact scenario his family's entire identity existed to prevent, playing out while Rome cheered it on. Ancient sources describe Brutus as reluctant, even guilt-tripped into joining the conspiracy led by his brother-in-law Gaius Cassius, though whether that reluctance was genuine or a flattering detail added later by sympathetic writers is impossible to verify at this distance. What is certain is what the plotters called themselves, the liberators, a name that tells you plainly how they understood their own actions. Not murder, not betrayal. The second founding of the Republic, delivered by the direct descendant of the man who'd founded it the first time. Cassius, by most accounts the conspiracy's actual architect, is generally described as the sharper political operator of the two, less troubled by conscience and more driven by personal resentment toward Caesar, who had passed him over for a coveted governorship. It's a useful contrast. The plot needed Brutus's name and reputation to give it moral legitimacy in the eyes of the Senate, and needed Cassius's nerve to actually organize it. Neither man could likely have pulled it off alone. There's a domestic detail worth adding here too. Brutus's wife, Porcia, was the daughter of Cato the Younger, one of the Republic's fiercest defenders of its old constitutional norms, and ancient sources claim she demanded to be told the plot in advance, going so far as to cut her own thigh with a blade, to prove she could keep a secret under pain. Whether that story is literal fact or a piece of moralizing added later to underline her stoic credentials, it fits the household Brutus was raised in and married into, one where political conviction was treated as something worth physical suffering to prove. They struck on the 15th of March, in a meeting chamber attached to a theater complex built, of all things, by Caesar's former rival Pompey. Roughly 60 senators were involved, and keeping a number that size secret until the moment it mattered remains one of the most genuinely impressive pieces of logistics in the ancient world, regardless of what you think of the outcome. If the ancient sources are to be believed, the universe made a fairly aggressive effort to warn him off first. A soothsayer had told Caesar to beware harm no later than the Ides of March. His wife reportedly dreamed of his murder the night before and begged him not to leave the house. Caesar felt unwell enough that morning to seriously consider staying home, and might have, except one of the conspirators arrived personally to escort him, needling him about whether the mighty Caesar was really going to skip the Senate over his wife's bad dream. Once the meeting began, a senator approached with a petition and grabbed Caesar's toga, yanking it from his neck. "Why, this is violence," Caesar reportedly said, which the historian Suetonius records as his last complete sentence, not the famous line Shakespeare would give him 16 centuries later. Then the room erupted. More than 20 of the conspirators struck at him, according to the sources, in a chaos so frantic that several ended up wounding each other in the crush to get close. Daggers came out from under togas on every side, and Caesar fought back, wounding at least one attacker, until he saw Brutus among them, blade drawn, and something in him simply stopped resisting. He pulled his toga over his face and let it happen. The liberators believed, apparently sincerely, that killing a would-be king would let the Republic simply resume functioning the way it had before. Brutus reportedly raised his bloody dagger afterward and called out for liberty, expecting the crowd to cheer. Instead, fueled by Mark Antony's funeral oration and the revelation that Caesar had left his private gardens to the public and cash to every citizen, the crowd turned on the assassins, and they fled the very city they claimed to have liberated. What followed wasn't a restored republic. It was over a decade of civil war, and the eventual rise of Caesar's adopted heir Octavian, who became Augustus, Rome's first emperor. Cicero, who wasn't part of the plot but celebrated it afterward, wrote privately within weeks that the tyrant was dead, but the tyranny had survived him, a line that turned out to be far more accurate than anything the conspirators themselves predicted. Within 2 years, Rome's new strongmen, Octavian, Mark Antony, and a general named Lepidus, formed an alliance and began systematically hunting down the men who had killed Caesar, publishing lists of enemies to be killed on sight and their property seized, Cicero himself among the first names on it. Brutus and Cassius, having fled east to raise armies of their own, were run down and defeated at Philippi in 42 BCE, and both took their own lives rather than be captured. The single act committed specifically to prevent one-man rule became the event that cleared the road for it. Brutus's story isn't really about greed or ambition. It's about a man who believed, based on everything he'd been taught to value, that loyalty to a constitutional tradition outweighed loyalty to a friend who had personally shown him mercy, and who then watched his own definition of loyalty produce the exact outcome he was trying to prevent. That's not a comfortable story. It's a story about how conviction, applied with total sincerity, can still be catastrophically wrong about its own consequences. Wrong in a way no amount of good intention on Brutus's part could retroactively fix, once the daggers were already down, and the republic he'd killed to save was already dying underneath him. Dying faster, if anything, for the killing having happened at all. If that unsettles you a little, we're only 2 cases in. If digging into cases like this, past the shorthand version everyone already knows, is landing the way we hope it is, this is a good moment to like the video and hit subscribe. And turning on notifications means you won't miss where this goes next, because it's about to get considerably stranger. Not every traitor on this list was working from a philosophy. Some of them were keeping score. Before Benedict Arnold became the most infamous name in American history, George Washington considered him possibly the best battlefield commander in the entire Continental Army, and the record backs that up. Need someone to march an army through 350 miles of frozen wilderness to invade Canada? Arnold did it. Need a navy built from nothing to challenge the British fleet on Lake Champlain? Arnold built it and fought it, in a battle at Valcour Island that historians still cite as one of the more improbable delaying actions in naval history. A scratch-built fleet of gunboats slowing a much larger British force by an entire year, buying the fledgling revolution time it desperately needed. Need someone to break the British line at Saratoga, in the battle that convinced France to enter the war on the American side? That was Arnold too, leading the charge historians now credit as the war's turning point. This is not a man who drifted into treason out of weakness. Whatever explanation eventually applies here, simple cowardice isn't going to be it. It helps to know where he started. Arnold was born in 1741 in Norwich, Connecticut, to a once prosperous merchant family that collapsed financially while he was still a boy, leaving his father to drink himself into irrelevance. Of his 5 siblings, only one survived to adulthood. Pulled out of school for lack of money and apprenticed to a cousin's apothecary shop, he rebuilt himself by his early 30s into a successful merchant sea captain in New Haven. When British taxes cut into his trade, he turned smuggler and joined the Sons of Liberty, which tells you something about his relationship with rules, even before the revolution started. Not opposed to breaking them, provided the cause justified it. When war broke out in 1775, he threw himself into it completely, and his grievances after that were never imagined. His wife died while he was off capturing Fort Ticonderoga that same year, and he learned of it only after returning from the campaign. He led the assault on Quebec with a musket ball in his leg. At Saratoga, that same leg was crushed again when his horse was shot from under him, leaving him permanently disabled, and the official credit for the victory went not to him but to his commanding officer, Horatio Gates, who'd spent much of the battle at a safe distance. Congress promoted 5 brigadier generals to major general in early 1777, every one of them junior to Arnold. Only Washington's personal intervention talked him out of resigning on the spot. Trying to do a wounded hero a favor, Washington gave Arnold command of newly liberated Philadelphia in 1778, a city full of wealthy Loyalist families and the kind of social life a battlefield doesn't offer, a genuine reward for genuine service, and one that put him in exactly the wrong social circle at exactly the wrong moment. Arnold, in his late 30s by then, threw himself into it, hosting lavish parties, running side ventures of questionable legality, and courting an 18-year-old named Peggy Shippen, whose father held Loyalist sympathies. Peggy also happened to be a close friend of a British officer named John Andre, who by this point was running British intelligence in America, a connection that would matter enormously within the year. A court-martial eventually found Arnold guilty on 2 minor counts, dismissing the more serious corruption charges outright, and sentenced him to a formal reprimand from Washington, who called his conduct imprudent and improper, a verdict Arnold seems to have experienced as a public humiliation regardless of how narrow it actually was. That reprimand usually gets treated as the final straw. It probably wasn't. Arnold's secret correspondence with the British had already begun 11 months before the reprimand arrived, which means whatever finally pushed him across the line, it wasn't one bad performance review. The decision predates it. The correspondence ran through intermediaries, partly in code, partly in invisible ink, with André personally handling the British side, which makes the earlier friendship with Peggy look considerably less like coincidence and considerably more like infrastructure that had been quietly in place for over a year. What Arnold offered wasn't loyalty to the British cause. It was a price, £20,000, the equivalent of millions today, for delivering command of West Point, the fortress Washington called the key to the entire continent, along with its garrison and defenses. He also sought £10,000 guaranteed regardless of outcome, a demand the British refused, agreeing only to pay in full once the fortress and its supplies were actually seized. He was negotiating this the way he'd negotiate a business contract, with contingencies and guaranteed minimums, not the way a man swept up in a single moment of desperation typically behaves, and the correspondence itself stretched on for months of careful positioning before either side committed to anything final. In August of 1780, Washington gave him command of West Point, genuinely believing he was handing a wounded hero a well-earned, lower-stress post. Arnold spent the following weeks quietly sabotaging it from the inside, thinning the garrison, scattering troops on make-work assignments, neglecting repairs, while sending Washington cheerful updates about how well everything was coming along. The plot unraveled almost by accident. American gunfire drove off the ship meant to carry André back to safety, forcing him to travel overland in civilian clothes, with the plans for West Point hidden in his boot. 3 militiamen stopped him near Tarrytown, and André, a trained intelligence officer, made the fatal misjudgment of assuming his captors were loyalists, and told them exactly who he was. They weren't, and they weren't fooled. The papers reached Washington's staff on the morning of September the 25th, while Washington himself was on his way to have breakfast at Arnold's headquarters. Arnold excused himself from the table, rowed to the river, and escaped to a waiting British warship with minutes to spare. Here's the detail that tends to get lost in the shorthand version, and it changes how the ending reads. The British paid Arnold roughly a third of what he'd asked for, and gave him a military commission he spent the rest of his life failing to turn into the status he clearly believed his betrayal had purchased. He spent his final years in London, unsuccessful in business, defending his reputation in a duel, and died in 1801 mourned, as far as the record shows, by almost no one on either side of the war he'd fought, and then sold out. In between, the British did send him back across the Atlantic to fight, and he led raids against his former countrymen in Virginia and Connecticut, including one against New London, the town near where he'd grown up, an operation that burned much of it to the ground and left dozens dead. Back on American soil, his memory received an unusual monument. A boot, cast in bronze, stands today on the Saratoga battlefield, honoring the leg wounded in his finest hour, deliberately inscribed without his name, a memorial to the wound rather than the man who earned it. Whatever complicated sympathy his earlier service might earn him, that particular campaign tends to close the door on it fairly firmly. If Arnold's story has a moral, it isn't about greed winning. It's about how completely a legitimate grievance can convince a person that betrayal is simply overdue compensation, rather than what everyone else will immediately recognize it as. Not every case here involves that kind of internal justification. Quisling, Brutus, and Arnold each betrayed something that had specifically elevated them: a government post, a mentor's mercy, a battlefield command. Each of them, in other words, had to first be trusted with something significant before they could betray it. The next man never held any position of trust to betray in the first place. He was simply someone the war happened to pass close enough to, with nothing to lose that the invading army couldn't offer to protect. Thermopylae means the hot gates, named for sulfur springs along the coastline, and in 480 BCE, it was one of the only routes by which a large army could march south toward Athens, a strip of land squeezed between mountains and sea that narrowed, at its tightest point, to barely the width of a cart. The Greek plan was never to defeat the Persian army there outright. Everyone involved understood that arithmetic would never work. The mission was to buy time, holding the pass long enough for the Greek navy to engage the Persian fleet nearby, and for the rest of Greece to organize a broader defense. Leonidas is said to have personally selected his 300 Spartans on one condition: that each already had a living son, so no family line would end at the pass. That force, alongside several thousand allied Greeks bringing the total closer to 7,000, held the pass against a Persian invasion historians estimate at somewhere between 120 and 300,000 men, though Herodotus himself claims a figure in the millions that modern historians treat as wartime exaggeration. Behind that number sat an empire that stretched from the Balkans to the Indus River, and Xerxes had brought with him the Immortals, an elite corps of 10,000 infantry kept permanently at that exact strength, replaced man for man the instant one fell, which is precisely the kind of force a narrow mountain pass was designed to neutralize. For 2 full days, the plan worked exactly as designed. The pass was narrow enough that Persian numbers didn't matter, and Persian infantry simply couldn't match Greek heavy armor and spears in that kind of confined fighting. When a Persian scout reported that the Spartans were calmly combing their hair before battle, and when a Greek was warned that Persian archers had enough men to blot out the sun with their arrows, the Spartan response, at least as Herodotus records it, was that they'd fight in the shade. Xerxes, watching from a hillside throne, is said to have leapt up in alarm 3 separate times. Then, on the evening of the second day, a local man named Ephialtes approached the Persian camp. He knew the terrain, and according to Herodotus, who is unusually direct about this, he came expecting a substantial reward. That's essentially the entire recorded motive. No ideology, no grievance against the Greeks, no claimed loyalty to a higher cause. He looked at the largest army on earth, stuck outside his own neighborhood, and recognized a transaction he was uniquely positioned to make. He knew about a mountain trail looping behind the Greek position, one an army could cross in a single night, and told the Persians exactly where to find it. The path had a name, Onopaia, and locals had used it for generations without it ever mattering to anyone outside the region. Ephialtes' contribution wasn't discovering it. It was recognizing exactly which foreign army would pay to know it existed. By dawn, Persian forces were coming down behind the defenders. Leonidas did the math immediately, dismissed the bulk of the allied army to fight another day, and stayed with his 300 Spartans, along with several hundred Thespian volunteers, and a group of Theban troops he reportedly kept against their will. They fought until their spears broke, then with swords, and when even the swords were gone, Herodotus has them fighting with their bare hands, until the position was overrun. Compare that motive to Quisling's tortured ideology, or Brutus's inherited sense of duty, or Arnold's years of accumulated grievance, and Ephialtes looks jarringly simple by comparison. It's tempting to reach for a unifying theory, that every betrayal conceals some deeper psychological justification, some sincere internal narrative the traitor tells to make the act bearable. Ephialtes complicates that theory rather than confirming it. As far as the record shows, he doesn't appear to have needed one. He saw an opportunity and took it. And that may be a harder thing to sit with than the elaborate self-justifications of the other cases, because it suggests some betrayals really are exactly as simple as they look. No hidden complexity required, no debt to settle, no cause to serve, no inherited name to live up to. Herodotus never even confirms whether Xerxes actually paid him, a fittingly unresolved footnote to a story about a payoff. What we do know is that once the Persians were driven out, the Greeks put a formal price on his head, and he spent years afterward in hiding from bounty hunters, a local man turned permanent fugitive in the same hills he'd once known well enough to sell out. He was eventually killed, years later, by another Greek, for reasons Herodotus explicitly says had nothing to do with Thermopylae at all, an unrelated personal quarrel. The Spartans honored his killer anyway, and his name survives in Greek to this day as another word for nightmare, close, by an unusually specific coincidence, to what the word already meant before he made it personal. He wasn't the only Greek accused of siding with Persia during that campaign either. The ancient Greeks had a specific term for city-states that submitted to or cooperated with the Persian invasion. Medizing, and several prominent communities, including Thebes, made that calculation openly rather than through a single individual's betrayal. What makes Ephialtes different, and what earned him a permanent place in the language rather than a footnote, is that he didn't just surrender to the inevitable. He actively supplied the information that turned a defensible position into an overrun one. The battle he decided didn't decide the war, which is worth remembering before moving on. Athens evacuated ahead of the Persian advance and watched the city burn. The Greek fleet regrouped and won decisively at Salamis weeks later, and the following year's victory at Plataea broke the invasion for good. Thermopylae bought exactly the time it was designed to buy. Ephialtes shortened that window, he didn't close it. A betrayal that mattered enormously in the moment, and comparatively little in the outcome, is its own quiet complication to add to everything else this story has raised. There's a wrinkle worth adding here too. Before the invasion, the Greek city-states had sent envoys to the oracle at Delphi, who returned with a prophecy so grim that Athens sent a second delegation, begging for something less catastrophic. What they got instead was a cryptic promise that a wooden wall would save them, which the Athenian statesman Themistocles argued meant their navy, a reading that shaped Greek strategy for the rest of the war and points directly toward Salamis. Thermopylae, in other words, wasn't fought in isolation. It was one move in a strategy that assumed, from the start, that the decisive fight would happen somewhere else. Which brings us to the case that might complicate all of it, because unlike the previous four, we genuinely don't know why this one happened, and the people closest to the events couldn't agree either. Even his name carries an unresolved question. The most widely accepted theory connects Iscariot to Kerioth, a town in southern Judea, which would make Judas the only one of the 12 not from Galilee, an outsider in the group from the start. A competing theory links the name to the Sicarii, dagger-wielding assassins who targeted Roman collaborators in crowds, though most scholars now consider that group to postdate Judas by decades, which weakens the theory without eliminating it. Even the number of silver pieces has generated centuries of argument on its own, since scholars still debate whether Matthew intended it as a specific, verifiable sum, or as a deliberate echo of an older prophetic text, chosen for its symbolic weight rather than its accuracy as a transaction record. Judas was one of 12 men chosen as Jesus' closest disciples, and by most reconstructions served as the group's treasurer, managing their shared funds. The Gospel of John describes him bluntly as a thief who helped himself to the money bag, which, if accurate, suggests whatever led to the betrayal in the Garden of Gethsemane had been building for some time before it became visible. Here's where the record genuinely thins out in a way none of the previous four cases did. The Gospels, our only substantial sources, don't agree on his motive. Matthew is straightforward: 30 pieces of silver, negotiated directly with the chief priests, a price that, by the schedule laid out in the book of Exodus, was specifically the compensation owed to a slave owner if the slave died. Matthew's gospel goes on to describe the chief priests, unwilling to put blood money back into the temple treasury, using it instead to buy a field for burying foreigners, a detail some scholars read as another layer of symbolic irony, rather than a straightforward transaction record. Whether that figure was meant as literal payment or a pointed insult built into the story is something scholars still debate. Luke offers a different explanation entirely, describing Judas as possessed, the betrayal arriving as an external force acting through him rather than a calculated decision. That distinction has occupied theologians for centuries, because the Gospels also describe the betrayal as something foretold, raising the uncomfortable question of whether Judas was ever really free to choose otherwise, or was simply playing a part that had already been written for him. Neither the text nor the scholarship fully resolves that tension, and it's presented here as an open theological question rather than a settled one. A harder-to-verify strand of interpretation, treated with real skepticism by most historians, suggests Judas may have expected Jesus to be a political liberator who would confront Roman occupation directly, and that the betrayal was less about money than disillusionment, an attempt to force a confrontation Jesus seemed unwilling to start on his own. Some modern scholars push this further still, arguing the betrayal may have been intended as a provocation rather than a rejection, a shove meant to trigger the uprising Judas believed was coming, which, if true, would mean he expected to be remembered as a catalyst rather than a villain. That reading remains a minority position, resting more on inference than direct textual support. But it's a useful reminder of how much interpretive weight 2,000 years of readers have hung on a handful of ambiguous verses. A surviving apocryphal text from the 2nd century, the Gospel of Judas, goes further still, inverting the story so that Jesus privately asks Judas to hand him over as an act of obedience. Mainstream historians treat it as a later theological composition rather than a reliable source, but its existence tells you something on its own. People have been trying to rewrite this particular motive for almost as long as the story has existed. None of these explanations can be confirmed against each other, and the ambiguity is the actual point of this final case. Where Quisling left trial transcripts and Arnold left intercepted letters, Judas left almost nothing in his own voice. What survives instead is a handful of later authors, writing decades afterward, each fitting the same act into a different explanatory frame. Matthew, writing for an audience steeped in Hebrew scripture, reaches for a price with scriptural weight behind it. Luke, more concerned with cosmic forces of good and evil, reaches for possession. Later writers, working in a very different theological climate, reach for disillusionment or even secret obedience. Same act, several different frames, and the sources give us no reliable way to know which one is closest to what actually happened. There's a smaller scene worth including here, because it shows the accusation building before the betrayal itself. A woman named Mary anoints Jesus' feet with expensive perfume, and Judas objects that it should have been sold and the money given to the poor, since it was worth roughly a year's wages. On its face, that's a reasonable objection. John's Gospel immediately undercuts it, adding that Judas said this not out of concern for the poor, but because he wanted access to the money himself. Whether that's a reliable account of his motive or a later narrator's editorializing is impossible to fully separate at this distance, but it fits the broader portrait of a man positioned, plausibly for some time, to skim from the fund he was trusted with. What the sources do agree on is the mechanism. At the Last Supper, Jesus reportedly announced that one of the 12 would betray him, and when Judas asked directly whether it was him, the response he received was less a denial than a confirmation dressed as a question. In the Garden of Gethsemane that night, Judas identified Jesus to an armed group with a kiss, a gesture of affection turned into a signal, which is precisely why Judas' kiss still means betrayal, disguised as intimacy 2,000 years later. Jesus was arrested and crucified soon after. The accounts of what happened to Judas diverge again from there. Matthew has him overcome with remorse, throwing the silver back into the temple and hanging himself. The book of Acts describes something considerably grimmer. Writing over 1,000 years later, Dante placed him at the absolute center of hell, the single figure Satan personally torments for eternity, alongside two names that should sound familiar by now: Brutus and Cassius, the men who killed Caesar. Dante wasn't working from historical analysis when he made that choice. He was working from a medieval Christian framework in which betraying a rightful lord, whether that lord was Christ or Rome's legitimate ruler, counted as the deepest possible violation of the social and cosmic order alike, which tells you as much about the values of Dante's own century as it does about the three men he condemned. That grouping wasn't an accident. Dante deliberately placed the three men history considers its ultimate traitors into the same eternal punishment, treating betrayal of a personal benefactor as the worst category of sin a human being could commit, worse even than murder or violence on their own terms. 5 people, 5 centuries, 5 genuinely different reasons, and yet the pattern resurfacing across most of them isn't cruelty for its own sake. It's conviction. Quisling believed he was saving Norway. Brutus believed he was saving the Republic. Arnold believed the debt he was owed justified collecting it by other means. Judas's belief may be permanently unrecoverable, buried under centuries of competing interpretation, which might be the most honest ending any of these 5 stories has. Only Ephialtes needed no belief at all, either the exception that breaks the pattern, or a reminder that not every explanation we go looking for is actually there to be found, that sometimes the search for meaning behind an act says more about the searcher than the act itself. It's worth pushing back on that framing before going any further, because there's a real argument against it, and it deserves more than a passing mention. Sincerity is cheap. Almost anyone can construct a story in which they're the hero, and the fact that Quisling believed he was saving Norway doesn't make the deportations he authorized any less deliberate, or any less his own choice to carry out rather than refuse. Treating self-belief as a meaningful mitigating factor risks doing exactly what these 5 men did to themselves, mistaking a comforting internal narrative for an actual justification. By that reading, the psychological complexity this documentary has been drawing out isn't insight at all. It's an excuse dressed up in more careful language, and legal systems generally agree, drawing a firm line between explaining why someone did something and excusing them for having done it. A defendant's motive can shape a sentence. It doesn't usually erase the crime. The people who suffered because of these 5 decisions, the Norwegian Jews on those ships, the American army waiting on the far side of a compromised fortress, the man crucified because someone he trusted led soldiers to a garden at night, didn't experience any of it as complicated. They experienced it as betrayal, plainly, and arguably that's the only verdict that actually matters. This documentary isn't going to resolve that tension for you. The two readings, that context complicates guilt, and that context is beside the point, aren't fully reconcilable positions, and maybe they shouldn't be. Courts weigh motive routinely without letting it erase a verdict. History tends to be worse at holding both ideas at once, because a single clean label travels a lot further than a complicated explanation ever will, and travels faster too, which might be exactly why the label always wins in the end. It's also worth asking why some traitors get the complicated treatment and others don't. Quisling gets analyzed. Ephialtes gets a dictionary entry and little else. Part of that gap is simply the record available to us, but part of it is almost certainly appetite. Audiences tend to want psychological depth from betrayals that feel close to their own moral universe, and want simplicity from the ones that feel safely distant. It's a lot easier to grant complexity to a man whose reasoning at least resembles something you could imagine talking yourself into, than to a man who, as far as anyone can tell, simply wanted the money and didn't think twice. And that asymmetry says as much about the audience doing the judging as it does about any of the 5 men actually being judged. So where does that leave the question this documentary opened with? Not with a tidy answer, because a tidy answer would be its own kind of dishonesty. What the record actually supports is something less comfortable. That betrayal, in most of history's most infamous cases, wasn't committed by people who saw themselves as villains in the moment. It was committed by people who believed, with varying degrees of sincerity and self-deception, that they were the ones being loyal to a cause, a tradition, a debt, or a grievance that felt, from the inside, more urgent than the trust they were breaking to honor it. That doesn't excuse a single one of these 5 names. If anything, it makes the label harder to look away from, because the distance between an ordinary person and history's next entry on this list isn't nearly as wide as the dictionary would like you to believe. The line runs through conviction, not through obvious villainy. And if that's true, the more useful question was never really about them. It's about which conviction, held tightly enough, might one day feel to you exactly the way loyalty does, and how you'd actually recognize the difference from the inside, in the moment it mattered, rather than years later with the verdict already written. None of them, in the moment, thought they were auditioning for a dictionary entry. Quisling thought he was ahead of history. Brutus thought he was restoring it. Arnold thought he was finally being paid what he was owed. Ephialtes thought he'd found a shortcut, nothing more complicated than that. Judas, whatever moved him, walked into a garden and did something ordinary with his mouth that became the single most infamous gesture of betrayal in the history of the written word. 5 centuries, 5 justifications, and 1 shared blind spot. Not one of them seems to have believed, until it was far too late to matter, that the story they were living through was the story everyone else would eventually tell about them. That's probably worth remembering the next time a decision in your own life feels justified enough that you don't bother questioning it twice. The way all 5 of these decisions must have felt, at least at first, to the men making them. Not because you're likely to end up carved permanently into a dictionary or a circle of hell, but because the mechanism these 5 stories describe doesn't require that scale to operate. It just requires a conviction strong enough to outrun the version of events everyone else is watching unfold in plain sight, often without even noticing the gap has opened between the two. History remembers the outcome. It rarely preserves the hour before, the quiet, private negotiation a person has with their own sense of what's justified, right up until the moment that negotiation becomes permanent, public, and belongs to everyone else's judgment instead of their own. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the version that doesn't collapse into a clean moral the moment you actually look at the evidence, the best way to catch the next one is to hit like on this video, and make sure you're subscribed to Alder with notifications turned on, so the next case lands in front of you the moment it's ready.